Our next session is titled Understanding the Asia-Pacific Geopolitics, Trade, and Investment. We have three speakers here today who are very well positioned to help us understand how this region is changing, how countries there view their own interests, how security issues intertwine with trade, and what all of this could mean for U.S. agriculture. I'll start here on the end. Ellen Frost is a senior advisor and fellow at the East-West Center, which is a nonprofit organization that was established by Congress to promote better understanding among the people and nations of the United States, Asia, and the Pacific. She has extensive experience across government and the private sector and academia, all focused in this region. Next, we have Wendong Zhang, who's an assistant professor in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. He has extensive research and public engagement experience on U.S.-China agricultural trade, the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal, and the global trade implications of critical Chinese agricultural market developments. And finally, we have Christine McDaniel, a senior research fellow in the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And also, I'm so pleased to welcome her first public appearance as the inaugural non-resident fellow in the Yeutter Institute. So really pleased to have you here, Christine, for the first time in that capacity. Her research focuses on international trade, globalization, and intellectual property rights. She, too, has extensive experience across government and also served as a senior economist in the global law firm of Sidley Austin. And I will be your moderator today for this session. So last evening, the panelists and I were visiting just informally about today's session, and Ellen said, well, Christine's studying Taiwan, and Wendong is really focused on China, so I guess I get to talk about everything else in the region. And so that's where we're going to start, because I think that everything else is really important, too, to understand. So Ellen, starting with you, because you have worked in about every area of the U.S. government, I think, that would have any interest in doing anything in this region on trade in particular, but you've also served in the Pentagon as well. So you have just a really interesting view from all those years, looking at the region from those different vantage points. So let's start by just exploring, why is this region so important for us to care about? Why does it matter? You've written about this, and you've talked about it from an export perspective, noting that about 30% of U.S. goods exports go to the region, so there's that lens. I'll just mention the Biden administration's recent national security strategy that was released has a very plain statement in there that notes the prosperity of everyday Americans is linked to the Indo-Pacific. So why? Why is that? Tell us a little bit more.
Let me count the ways. The economic importance of Asia has already been discussed. I would merely add that imports from Asia are important, and that the health of the Asian economy matters a lot to the states in the United States, including Nebraska. Something like $4.6 billion of exports from Nebraska go to Asia, and about a 1.6 billion or so per year is meat or meat products. So we all know about that. I'm not planning to dwell much on any of that. But let's remember that 5 treaty allies are in Asia, 5. And these are a bulwark of our security in the Asia-Pacific region. They're cooperative partners. They help to offset some of the security threats in the conventional sense, and increasingly in a non-traditional security threat situation. The national security strategy that Jill just referred to says that Asia is the epicenter of the climate crisis. So that's one very important common interest we have with Asians. It's also a very important part of the world from the point of view of global health. Think where the pandemic started, and I don't need to tell you more about that. There's also the ties with Americans, Asian Americans in particular, but all Americans. We have something like 23 million or so, I think, of Americans who identify with one or more country in Asia, and the social ties are immense. The final thing I'll say in this very preliminary, superficial list is peaceful norms. When you think about Asia at the end of World War II, there was a lot of communist insurgencies, rebellions of one kind or another. And over time, particularly the Southeast Asian nations, but also Japan and, yes, China to some extent, built and propagated peaceful norms. There has been no war between members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, no war between any two of them since the organization was founded in 1967. So right now, ASEAN leaders, particularly the founding five, are very keen on looking forward instead of backward and promoting peaceful norms instead of war. So for all of those reasons, I would say that we should care a lot about Asia.
Thank you, Ellen. Christine, I want to turn to you next and think a little bit about why we need to care about this region from a different point of view. You've done a lot of work very recently on estimating the cost of a potential conflict would have in the Taiwan Strait, and so you've looked at container shipping in the region, undersea cables that carry a lot of data that flows around the globe. So tell us a little bit more about those factors and what you have been finding in your research on that topic.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And again, I'm so excited to be here at the Yeutter Institute. So on a less bright note, a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So my colleague Weifeng Zhang and I, when we started out looking at this, I'll talk a little bit about the methodology issues, which some of you will find interesting in a sec. But we really wanted just to identify the key direct vulnerabilities for the U.S. economy if there was an incident in the Taiwan Strait, and so the two key vulnerabilities that we identified, obviously, one, container shipments, and two, digital flows. So container shipments are pretty obvious, but this is where the U.S. Navy comes in. But and there's been a number of studies on this. But just looking at, just thinking about those numbers Ellen just put out, if some of our container shipment routes were disrupted in the Taiwan Strait, it depends on the scope of how the scope of the kinetic conflict. For instance, if ships couldn't go through the Taiwan Strait and had to go around the island, right, that would add a certain amount of time. If they couldn't go, if they couldn't go just right around the island, but they had to go down through underneath Indonesia, that would be even more costly and more time consuming. But if they couldn't even do that and had to go all the way down around Australia, that now we're talking about 4 to 6 weeks at least delay per shipment and a cost of $2.8 billion per month. So just think of that in the context of what Ellen just said, right? So it will eat into those the values of those trade flows pretty quickly. The greater the geographical scope of that conflict. So that's container shipments. Another big flow that is invisible, but is really allowing all of you guys to use your phones all the time. Digital flows. Most people think of data. Where do you guys think data is mostly stored? The cloud, you mostly think of the cloud, right? Well, guess what? It's actually 99% of data flows across the seabeds of our world's oceans. And there are these submarine cables that go through, right all around the world. They've been around for decades and decades, but there's really been in the past 20 years or so, U.S. across the Pacific, these submarine cables have increased in number. And this is where all of our data goes. In fact, it's so important that U.S. Like New York Stock Exchange traders will, before they hit the send button for a trade, they'll double check to see which cable their trade's going to go through because they want to make sure it's through a safe submarine cable. Right? So it's something that a lot of us don't think about on a day-to-day basis. But it turns out there aren't a lot of international legal norms around how these submarine cables are treated in a kinetic conflict. somebody mentioned once to me, well, what about the International Red Cross? Because if you're not supposed to affect hospitals, well, if a hospital depends on data, and they can't get data because the submarine cable was disrupted, does that count? It's a big question mark. International lawyers say that's a good question. We haven't really figured that out yet. The last time these laws were written, or decades ago, before these submarine cables became proliferated. So disruption of submarine cables could disrupt the U.S. economy in a number of ways. And then, of course, the landing stations themselves. These landing stations, there's a couple, I think a couple in the north of the Taiwan island and one in the south. And in our research, we found, actually obtained an open source intelligence data set, which was sort of a new method for me. But the short of it is that these submarine cable landing stations are definitely on the radar, no pun intended, of the Chinese military. And so, China is no stranger to the sensitivity and the importance of these submarine cable landing stations and submarine cables themselves. So those are the two direct vulnerabilities for the U.S. economy that we identified.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. So Wendong, I want to turn to you next, and you can help us, I think, understand why Christine is researching this potential, event, and help us understand how China views Taiwan and remind the audience of the central role that island plays in U.S.-China relations.
Great. Really great to be here. And now, after working along with Ed and John for 7 years at Iowa State, now I work at Cornell. So I first want to say that the mascot of Cornell is actually Big Red Bears as well. So I want to say, go Big Red first. Before I answer the question on Taiwan, I want to start with something warmer and fuzzy, why this region matters, and to give you some personal examples that why China matters for Nebraska and the broader region. For example, I grew up in a rural county in China. My county has 1 million people. So that's one fact. The second fact is if you look at the agenda and see my last name, there are 100 million people who share the same last name. And that's one of the reasons why China still matters, and for this region and for the U.S. in general as well. Regarding Taiwan, China just had an important party congress. That is, if you don't know, that the Chinese current president Xi Jinping, it's a new president, probably at least for another 2 terms, likely 3. So it's for the next 10, 15 years that we will see the same president in China. And Taiwan is a critical issue that I think is sort of one of the justification that what he want to achieve. From Chinese government perspective, Taiwan is part of China. From China's perspective, that this is also acknowledged through the treaty between U.S. and China as part of the normalization of the relationship. So there are 3 tranches that U.S. either use a word where there's caused a lot of confusion and tension is that in some places that U.S. acknowledge China's position. In some places that U.S. say U.S. recognize Chinese position. But the Chinese position is that Taiwan is part of China, and the Chinese government is the only legitimate government of representing China. And also that people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait recognize there's only one China, and the government in Taiwan is formally called the Republic of China, which, if you look at the constitution and the map, also includes mainland China, right? So so that's one of the key issue. And another thing is that from China's perspective, that it's U.S. and Taiwan is causing the attentions and the possibility for the peaceful reunification of the Chinese territory is the possibility are dwindling, and they have to retain the forceful option as a last resort. Right? So that's probably the gist of the Chinese position.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, let's go back to you and take a look at kind of the region now. How has it changed in the last 6 years? You wrote a terrific piece for Asia Policy last year that I commend to everyone, kind of summarizing all of this. So a year later, especially since the U.S. pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership several years ago now, how have things changed since then?
I think the region is changing very dynamically, and there isn't a whole lot of understanding of all of the changes that have occurred in the period that Jill just specified. It's normal to feel a little insecure when your major security guarantor is thousands of miles away, and there have been many points in U.S.-Asia relations where the governments are insecure about our own commitment. I have to say that in the Trump era in particular, there was more and more of a sense that the United States really wasn't going to send any help if needed. The United States was not interested in re-engaging, and then, of course, the tearing up of the TPP commitment was an example, only one of several examples of the contempt with which then President Trump treated multilateral affairs in general, and the allies in particular. The last straw was cozying up to the dictator of North Korea and saying he was in love. I mean, really, you know. So the process of the last post-Trump years has been to try to re-engage the United States in every way that we can, consistent with what we can get away with in Congress. So unfortunately, there's no trade agreement, likely a major trade agreement, to be submitted to Congress, I think, in the next, 4 years. But there has been, on the other hand, a strong interest in engaging in the digital economy, transition to a digital economy. All kinds of issues that I couldn't begin to understand are the subject of small, mini trade agreements, some of them Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, for example, if I've got my countries right. So the United States has been engaged in that kind of discussion and agreement seeking, and that's, I think, where trade itself is headed in the near term, and that trend started, accelerated in this period that Jill mentioned. So, but don't ever think that agriculture is exempt from what's been going on. We know that when the Philippines took to the arbitration panel in The Hague, pursuant to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Chinese were so mad that they invented some inspection requirements that were very lengthy on shiploads of Philippine bananas. Now, what do you think happens to bananas when they're sitting in Manila Harbor in the summertime? Okay. Later on, this wolf warrior diplomacy, as some people call it, from China, it extended to other countries' agricultural products, Australia being an example. So it's definitely in the ag community worth watching what is going on in that murky geopolitical sense. The thing that I'd like to emphasize heavily here is, going back to the question of what's changed, is the role of Japan. Japan, under Prime Minister Abe, beginning his second term in 2012, undertook a series of really important initiatives. We all know in foreign policy that getting your boss to show up is half the battle. In the first year, Abe visited all 10 of the Southeast Asian countries. And in about 2014 or so, he came up with the best initiative you've never heard of. It's called PQI, Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. The background, of course, was China's Belt and Road Initiative. And everybody loves everybody. You understand, this isn't intended to be hostile. Oh, no, no, no. But Partnership for Quality Infrastructure drew attention to the fact that China's Belt and Road projects were often criticized for shoddy engineering, not to mention bulldozing indigenous people out of the way and raping the forests and so forth. So Japan has really been a leader in setting very high standards for sort of a housekeeping and good housekeeping seal of approval for major infrastructure projects, with the Asian Development Bank, which is always headed by a Japanese, as a full partner, and even the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was the Chinese initiative, all cooperating together in this way, with Japan getting quite a lot of credit. There's an annual survey of Southeast Asian populations comes out from Singapore every year. And one of the questions is, which external power do you trust most to do the right thing? The answer is consistently Japan. Now think about the wartime record and how Southeast Asians have looked forward, cooperating with Japan and not digging up, they lost a battle in 800 AD or something. This is a very a strong relationship backed by years of low-key diplomacy, not lecturing the Southeast Asians, providing very generous aid and so forth. So Japan's economic statecraft, and there's an office for this now in the Prime Minister's office itself. This is another innovation from Mr. Abe. And that the geopolitical significance of economic statecraft is not lost on anybody in Asia, and that's sort of the big change in Jill's question that I'd like to emphasize. The other I'll go over this more quickly. Because of China-U.S. tensions, any Southeast Asian official asked to choose between China and the U.S. will promptly, throw stones at you. They don't want to have to be in that position to have to choose. So they play different sides against each other. They don't appreciate when the United States comes in and constantly tries to criticize China and gather democratic countries sort of against China. We can talk about that later on. But the Southeast Asians did produce the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. It was 16 countries. India dropped out, so it's 15 countries. And I should have mentioned this, of course, Japan rescued the TPP and turned it into the TPP. Nobody really expected Japan to do that. They did. So there's all this going on behind the scenes. It's peaceful, with the exception of the Taiwan situation, of course. And it's really made a difference in the dynamics of the region. In fact, the same national security strategy says that Asia, or actually the Indo-Pacific as we now call it, is the epicenter of the geopolitics of the 21st century. And so a lot of that is going on in a constructive direction, and definitely the entry of Australia as a more active player, and India is a little more ambivalent, but India's now in the game, in the Quad, Indo-Pacific, we now call it. All of those are factors that are working, I think, in a way that promotes stability in the region, despite the threat from China. So I'm sorry to go on at such length, Jill, but there it is.
No, thank you. That's a great summary, Ellen. And your emphasis on Japan was one part of what you described as rival regionalisms in your paper, with the other being China, kind of both vying for leadership in the region. So Wendong, I want to turn to you and ask you to follow up on a little bit of that. So Ellen mentioned the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which China is part of, the U.S. is not. So tell us a little bit about what China is seeking to achieve politically and economically through the RCEP, as well as through the Belt and Road Initiative.
So thank you. And for those of you who don't know, RCEP, as Ellen mentioned, it includes the 10 Southeast Asian countries, but also China, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So importantly, there are several objectives from China's perspective. I think one is there are a desire, especially since President Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, there is a deliberate a strategic thinking to diversify the supply chain and the import portfolio. And it's especially now with the US-China trade war, there's a deliberate strategic initiatives to try to reduce the reliance on US products. So RCEP is being one of the efforts. And for example, it's forged the first time the free trade ties between Japan and South Korea, Japan and China. So those are some of the important ones. And so for Belt and Road initiatives, it's if you haven't heard of this, is sometimes branded as a BRI, and you can think of this as a revival of the Silk Road initiatives that China had like over 1,000 years. But if you look at BRI, it not only includes the Belt and Road, the Silk Road, but also stretch to even include some of the places in Africa and also South America. So it's a more less constrained to the conventional routes. Of course, I think there are diversification strategies that are going on. There's another perspective that China want to maybe to use these opportunities to divert the over excessive productive capacity that China have a lot more steel production, for example, and this provided a lot of investment that the Chinese company are investing in African or Central Asian countries. And third, I think there's a way to strengthen ties economically and try to build maybe political relations. And as Alan mentioned, that there are some criticism about, especially BRI, when the Chinese company promised a much quicker turnaround for the project, they are forced to use Chinese laborers rather than the domestic laborers in these projects to achieve more streamlined projects. So there are revision of those thinking of how to better engage local production and to avoid criticism from that perspective. And I think the pandemic put a reset in these efforts, and there are more revival of these activities. And there's a recent infrastructure development, for example, connecting southern part of China and Laos, which is one of the Asian countries that would cut the travel time within Laos from 2 days to 3 hours through the high-speed rails, right? So you can argue for that how geopolitically this means, because these new railroads built by the Chinese company would be using the rail line that is more consistent and more connected to the Chinese high-speed rails as well, right? But there are a lot of there's a lot of things going on in this, but it's quite important to take notice as well.
Thank you, Wendong. Christine, coming to you next, I want to take a different angle or ask you a different sort of question on China, and that is, we've heard it said a lot over the last few years that WTO rules did not perhaps anticipate the way in which China's economy would develop, the way in which that economy operates, being so integrated with the Communist Party, and that the conventional wisdom underlying U.S. policy in the 1990s and early 2000s, that as China opened up economically, it would liberalize politically, that missed the mark. So that's said a lot. And my question for you is, do you think we're moving beyond kind of post-gaming that situation and moving toward crafting a new strategy based on current realities and new assumptions on China and how to deal with how different its economy operates, and especially in the context of the WTO here?
Yeah, so this is what is on everyone's minds, of course, including, obviously, Andrea Durkin's. And yeah, in a way, it's still, I think, kind of sinking into everybody that that perhaps this thing that we've built and have been using for decades might not be usable. If you go back and read the transcripts of the Bretton Woods conference in the 1944, go back and read those transcripts, right? And a couple things. There are two things that the founding members had in common, and those two things really, I think, propelled everyone's movement and buy-in into a lot of these international institutions like the WTO we see today. One was they wanted to rebuild from the war. Right, World War II. I mean, costliest, deadliest, thing they had ever lived through. Number two, they wanted to make it way too costly, so so that type of war they'd never have to go through that again. Okay, those were the two things that the founding members they all had that in common, right? So they leave Bretton Woods, they go out, and then all these different initiatives. And you can draw a line from that to the GATT, right? The GATT, you and I do business with each other. Well, the more my companies in my country do business with your companies in your country, the more pressure there's going to be on me and you to go to war with each other, right? And that was kind of like that Wilsonian peace and prosperity, but it was really more like let's put these incentives in place to really disincentivize war, right? China they weren't really part of that, right? They don't share that same history. They were at Bretton Woods, but they weren't one of the founding members, an active founding member. They don't have that same buy-in to that way of looking at the world that we do. And we have to kind of wake up to that. And I don't think we have fully. I think we're starting to. And maybe it will take a decade or two. But in the meantime, we're definitely realizing, all these rules we put in place, they may not work out so well. What are we going to do? And now we're going down these roads that will be think if all of a sudden the appellate body came back. Think of how many cases would have to be brought. So many countries have strayed afar from their WTO commitments already, including the U.S. So, the question is, at what point are we going to just not be able to come back to the WTO anymore? Or is it going to be where there is a new set of rules and we kind of go back and level set? I don't know. These are, I have no idea. But we do need to, in the meantime, definitely look for new types of solutions. And I think fisheries is a microcosm of the global commons resource problem, if you will. We have seen that, and we call, we talk about the WTO like it's that thing over there, but the WTO is just a member of the countries. We are the WTO. So to criticize the WTO is really just, it's not really, it doesn't make sense, right? It's criticizing. You can't really criticize the WTO. You're basically saying all the members of the WTO, they don't have incentive to cooperate anymore the way they used to. Right. So the language that we use is really important. And I think if we just kind of keep criticizing the WTO, we're never going to get anywhere because we may have to try, different routes. And so that's one thing actually we're working on, at the Mercatus Center, and I'm excited to talk to the scholars here at Nebraska about it, is new approaches, how to incentivize cooperation among participants when you take into full account the realities of what they want to do and what they don't want to do. The WTO rules assume that countries are going to cooperate, and if they don't, well, you can take them to the WTO appellate body or DSU and appeal and all this. But we're not doing that right now, and chances are, I don't see us doing that for quite a while. So without the WTO, how are we going to solve these global problems, which frankly we can't do without China, right? China can't solve these without the US. The US can't solve these problems without China. We really have to, and this is where Ambassador Yeutter comes in. Remember when he said, be bold, creative, innovative. I remember right when I got back from Australia around 2015, 16, I remember attending this breakfast at the Peterson Institute. It's just small, off the record. And here we are on the record, but I've said this, other people have said it too. So, but I remember it was sort of oh yeah, what are we going to do about steel? And they were, a lot of people were criticizing the U.S. on steel, and how it wasn't going to work. And I remember saying, look, one way it could work is the U.S. and its, like-minded countries basically form their own trade bloc, but we all have to sign up to the same rules. And if China wants to sign up to those rules, great. But if not, then they are out of that trade bloc. Everyone looked at me like I was crazy. I remember that. Well, that is kind of what is happening now, right? And I'm not saying it's a welfare-enhancing solution, but that is kind of what is happening now, and if that you put that on fast forward, that's a very scary world that we're facing when we don't have a trading relationship with China. If you line everyone up around the world, every fifth person is Chinese. So any solution has to involve China. So we're going to have to figure out how to cooperate with China on these key issues, and it might not involve the WTO. But I think we do have we really need a lot of creativity and boldness in the solution finding arena.
Thank you, Christine. I want to come back to another element here that Ellen mentioned earlier, and that is trust. And that is another key concept in your paper that you wrote last year. You wrote something very interesting I want to quote, and you said, quote, "Leaders in Asia want the United States to return to the table, but not necessarily to sit at the head," unquote. So I'd like you to expand on that a little bit more and tell us what do leaders in Asia want? Do they all want the same thing? And what do they want to see from the United States in terms of leadership and engagement in the region?
Before I answer that, I can't help commenting on what you just said. My plan for steel, by the way, which was also considered crazy, was to revive the Davignon plan, which is what they did after the war. Everybody agreed to build down the capacity so they didn't have too much steel. All right? See, we could solve the problems of the world right here. This business about sitting at the head of the table, when Joe Biden was a candidate, he wrote something in Foreign Affairs that said, oh, we've got to get back to the head of the table. And he still comes up with comments that there's no greater need than the world has for U.S. leadership, which really smacks of hubris. But more than that, it ignores or downplays the sensitivity that Asians have about interference in their domestic affairs, including our own allies in Southeast Asia. Every Southeast Asian country except Thailand was a colony. And if you've been a colony and you've been humiliated, there's a little extra something in your outlook. Even the Xi Jinping's conviction of being humiliated in the century of humiliation, even Putin arguably. I mean, we have not been defeated on our own territory in war, unless you count the American South, which is where you do have a sense of pride and humiliation. So I'm going off track, I know, but I'm coming back to the basic point that Jill is raising, which is how do you exert leadership by sitting at the table, but not at the head of it, and as a self-appointed, leader. One thing we have to do at the same time, I think, is stop preaching, especially when we are often accused rightfully of double standards. We preach human rights and democracy, and then we go and give a fist bump to a guy in Saudi Arabia. No, that's been a longstanding complaint about American behavior. One Asian official said in response to this question, talk less and do more, right? So if you look at IPEF, the latest effort to kind of compensate for absence in CPTPP, there's a whole laundry list of really good stuff in all the categories in which we can really contribute to the Indo-Pacific in all kinds of ways. I'd like to see more visible attention to that, and I'd like to see also the much greater public diplomacy effort. This is a bipartisan priority, but the U.S. Information Agency disappeared a while back, and there isn't a whole lot of money for that. But if you think about America's strengths, innovation, diversity, enthusiasm, forward-looking, if you watch the Webb telescope videos and the people who built this marvelous invention, it's so exciting. I think they should be played on every U.S. embassy around the world. I'm just giving you a sense of how to be a good listener, how to be a good partner, how to be credible in your commitments, how to avoid double standards, and that's what I think needs to be done the most. Now, the question that Jill raised is, do ASEAN leaders all want the same thing? I think in this area, not choosing between the United States and China, having the U.S. as a more respectful partner, I think they're all in agreement. Beyond that, it varies enormously, between landlocked Laos on the one hand and Singapore on the other, and Indonesia and so forth. So I don't think there's a united view, but when it comes to something that really disrupts the stability of the region, and here I would list Myanmar government's behavior, they do sort of try to pull together, even though they don't have any real enforcement capacity. So it's very much worth investing in Asia, I think, but just being careful to figure out the geopolitics of it at the same time. No easy task.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. Agriculture is always very, very important here, of course. And so, Wendong, I want to ask you to assess the US-China Phase 1 deal. We know very well, because it gets a lot of headlines, that China fell very short on its purchase commitments as part of that deal, including on US agricultural products. But I think less attention gets paid to the other elements of that deal, on agriculture in particular, where China had to undertake 57 policy changes to ease the way for more exports of agricultural products from the US to the country. What do we know about China's follow-through on those elements? And can you measure the impact, if there was follow-through, on US agricultural flows to China?
So first, if you, so my Iowa State colleague, Dermot Hayes, and I have written an article about this, and we sort of titled this as bigger pie, smaller shares. So if you assess the impacts overall, if you just look at the dollar amounts or the metric tons of agricultural product sent from the US to China, that we get 2 record years during the 2 years of the Phase 1 deal. But at the same time, that is, if you measure the percent of the products that China bought from the US as a relative share of all the stuff that they bought from all the other countries, that the share is dwindling. And that share started dwindling probably a decade ago. And another caveat of the Phase 1 deal is that if you look at a lot of the increase in the purchases of Chinese products from the US, they're not necessarily driven by the Phase 1 deal. They're driven by domestic Chinese policy changes, especially with African swine fever. Because of the African swine fever, that Chinese diet, the pork accounts for 60% of the meat that Chinese people eat, and 97% of the pork that's produced within China because of the food security concerns. And that African swine fever led to a 40% reduction in the hog herd, which led to the meat shortage. And also during the rebuilding of the hog herd, there's a increase in the demand for feed grains that led to, corn imports as well. So I think that there are a lot of caveats in the effectiveness of the Phase 1 deal. This does lead to a lot more careful changes within China. The China sort of passed legislation to ban forced technology transfer. We need to see how effective those are, carried out. But there are a lot more analysis into those, and they're more streamlined in terms of GM variety approval in China as well. At the same time that the previous speaker, the panelist talked about that the Mexican becoming more probably opposed to the GM technology. In China, is an interesting dynamic that is going on is that the trade war sort of gives them a little more incentive to sanction and to move forward with the GM trial. That is for the first time, I think, that China currently are doing GM trials of corn and soybean production of domestically Chinese technology, and the invention of the CRISPR technology also give China sort of a technological level field that they feel that they can invest a lot more and accelerate the process. So there are some progress, but I think there are a lot of the things are sort of not easily verified, and in a way, the Phase 1 deal also avoided a lot of the really significant thorny issues about state subsidy, as the speaker talked about as well. So.
Thank you, Wendong. We have just a couple of minutes left in this session, so if there are any audience questions, we'd be happy to take those. Yeah, over here.
Hi, Tyler Wellman from Lincoln. You all kind of touched on this, so whoever feels best to answer the question can go ahead. What are your thoughts, or what are you hearing on the rumblings that U.S. manufacturing companies may be looking to move from China to India, just due to the maybe perceived unreliability of China, as well as the growing Indian workforce?
Add little bits of information. I've been trying to get data of this sort, and I haven't seen it yet, but I don't think India is, well, first of all, some companies are choosing to stay in China, period. The ones that are under pressure from stakeholders or decided for other reasons that they don't want to be subject to sanctions and so on, they are looking actively around the region. And my impression so far, I stand to be corrected, is that some of the Southeast Asian countries are more attractive to them than India is. And Bangladesh is another target. I mean, we all know about the license Raj in India and the high levels of restrictions on imports and investment and their fear of China and all the rest of it. So that's just my impression, that it's going on, but not overwhelmingly.
I want to add a little bit that if you look at, there are different elements of the manufacturing industry. If you look at T-shirts, there's already shifts away from China to other countries, Vietnam, Honduras, and other places. If you look at more higher end products, it's really hard to move away from China, because not only you require large worker base, but it's also that the education and the technical expertise of the workers as well. India also has some of the challenges with infrastructure, which China has done a lot better job in that. So you will see that the firm probably move. The firm will make country-specific challenges. That one of the interesting cases is that when the U.S. put tariffs and trade actions against Korean-produced washing machines and ad studies, for example, the Korean firms essentially moves the products from being produced in Korea to China. And then the U.S. trade action will say that if you're producing this in China, that you will also subject to some sort of the trade action. Then they move along to Vietnam and other places as well. You will see that the firms finding ways to sort of get around these specific rules and how to shore up their supply chains.
We are out of time, so I am sorry to say this has gone really fast. I want you all to please join me in thanking these panelists here for sharing their insights.